The stranger in the cage. The merchant vessel, Nebula Runner, was a haphazardly patched-together ship, its hull stained with scorch marks and its engines humming unevenly as it docked at a trading outpost orbiting the barren moon of Krellin, 4. Captain Mark Hale, a seasoned trader with sharp instincts and a deep distrust of unfamiliar faces, stepped off the ramp and into the dimly lit bay, his boots clicking against the cold metal floor. Mark wasn't here to explore, he came for supplies and fuel. The outpost was known for its rough edges, attracting smugglers, rogue traders, and mercenaries. It wasn't the kind of place for long conversations or moral debates. Yet, as he moved through the cluttered rows of goods, his attention was drawn to a low, rhythmic hum emanating from a dark corner of the bay. Curiosity, one of Mark's most persistent weaknesses, tugged at him. He adjusted the strap on his plasma rifle and made his way toward the sound. Behind a stack of mismatched crates was a crude cage made of reinforced steel bars. Inside, a figure sat motionless, their silhouette partially hidden by shadows. As Mark approached, the figure moved slightly, and dim light revealed pale blue skin shimmering faintly. The woman, if she could be called that, was unmistakably alien. Her silver hair flowed over her shoulders in tangled waves, and her piercing violet eyes locked onto Mark with a ferocity that stopped him in his tracks. She was wearing what looked like the remnants of some kind of ceremonial robe, now torn and stained, but it was her stance that unsettled him. Even confined, she exuded the presence of a predator biding its time. "Interested in a rare find, Captain?" The voice belonged to Rax, the station's sleazy trader, who emerged from the shadows with a smirk that revealed his chipped teeth. "Picked her up near the Zenthari belt. Feisty little thing. Got her cheap." Mark turned to face Rax, his jaw tightening. "She's not cargo, Rax." "What is this?" Rax shrugged, his grin widening. "Call her what you want, slave, prisoner, exotic pet. Doesn't matter. Someone will pay a fortune for her. You wouldn't believe the demand for Zenthari females." Mark's stomach churned. "You think this is some kind of joke?" "No joke," Rax replied casually, pulling a cigar from his jacket and lighting it. "Look, I don't care what you do with her. Buy her, leave her, it's all the same to me. I'm just here to make credits." Mark turned back to the cage. The woman hadn't moved except for her eyes, which now watched him intently. There was no fear in them, only a sharp, calculating intelligence. Her hands rested on the bars, and Mark noticed faint scars around her wrists, evidence of shackles. "Does she speak?" Mark asked, keeping his voice calm. "Not a word of standard," Rax said, exhaling a puff of smoke. "Tried getting her to talk, but all I got were those Zenthari hisses. Whatever. You want her, make me an offer. Otherwise, I've got another buyer lined up." Mark hesitated, the weight of the moment settling over him. Every instinct told him to walk away, to leave this mess behind and stick to his own problems. But something in her eyes stopped him. This wasn't just some frightened captive, this was someone dangerous, someone with a story. "How much?" Mark asked, his tone sharp. Rax raised an eyebrow. 10,000 credits. 10,000. Mark's voice rose in disbelief. "You're insane." Rax shrugged. "Fine, 5,000. I like you, Captain. Call it a discount." Mark's hand instinctively moved to his blaster holster. He didn't trust Rax, but the thought of leaving the woman here made his blood boil. 3,000. Final offer. Rax grinned. "Deal." Within an hour, the cage had been transferred to the Nebula Runner's cargo hold. Mark's crew, a mix of grizzled veterans and green recruits, gathered around to gawk at their new passenger. "Captain, are you out of your mind?" said Elena, Mark's first officer. She was tall and no-nonsense, with a knack for saying what everyone else was too scared to. "We're not equipped to deal with, whatever she is." Mark glared at her. "She's not a threat unless we treat her like one. Elena folded her arms. And if she's dangerous? What then? Mark didn't answer. Instead, he approached the cage, crouching to meet the woman's eyes. She stared back, unblinking, her posture as calm and deliberate as before. He placed a small tray of food and water on the floor and slid it closer with his boot. "Do you understand me?" he asked quietly. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she leaned forward and sniffed the food cautiously. After a moment, she grabbed it and retreated to the far corner of the cage, eating in silence. Elena shook her head. "This is a bad idea." "It's done," Mark said firmly. "We're not leaving her here to be sold like cargo." As the crew dispersed, Mark stayed behind, watching the woman as she ate. Something about her felt different. She wasn't cowering or begging for freedom. She was waiting. For what, he couldn't say. One thing was clear, this was no ordinary passenger. Somewhere in the dark recesses of his mind, Mark wondered if he'd just signed up for far more trouble than he could handle. The secrets beneath the silence. The Nebula Runner drifted silently through the dark void of space, its engines humming softly as Mark sat in his quarters, staring at the datapad in his hands. The woman, who his crew had started referring to simply as the alien, remained an enigma. She hadn't spoken a word, hadn't made any attempts to escape, and yet her every move seemed deliberate, like she was planning something. The datapad flickered to life, displaying the scans his ship's medical system had taken of her earlier. Her physiology was unlike anything Mark had seen, even after years of trading across alien territories. The pale blue skin shimmered faintly under light, and her neural patterns spiked in unusual frequencies. Her DNA carried markers of advanced genetic manipulation, suggesting she was either engineered or enhanced. Mark leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "What are you hiding?" he muttered to himself. In the cargo hold, the alien woman, who the crew now called Lyra after overhearing her whisper the name in her language, was no longer sitting idly in her cage. She had begun to explore her surroundings, her sharp violet eyes scanning every detail of the room. Her movements were fluid, almost unnervingly so, as if she were a predator in an unfamiliar environment. Elena entered the hold with two crew members, her sharp gaze fixed on Lyra. "She's been quiet, but I don't trust it," Elena said, crossing her arms. "What's she even doing?" "She's watching," replied one of the crew, a young engineer named Tobias, nervously. "Like, studying us?" Elena frowned. "Mark's got more faith in her than I do. But until we know what she's capable of, no one gets close." Suddenly, Lyra's gaze snapped toward them, her intense eyes locking onto Elena's. The crew froze, the silence in the room stretching uncomfortably. Lyra stood, her movements deliberate, and approached the bars of her cage. She raised a hand slowly, placing it against the steel. For a moment, it looked like she was trying to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she tapped the bars in a rhythmic pattern. "What's she doing?" Tobias whispered. Elena shook her head. "I don't know, but I don't like it." Later that day, Mark decided it was time to take a risk. He couldn't keep her locked up indefinitely, not if he wanted answers. He called the crew to the common room, where they debated the decision. "She's been calm so far," Mark said, pacing in front of the crew. "But if we treat her like a prisoner, we'll never learn what she's really after. And if she decides to tear us apart the second she's out of that cage?" Elena countered, her tone sharp. "What then, Mark?" Mark stopped and turned to her. "Then we handle it. But I'm willing to bet she's more interested in survival than in killing us." After a tense silence, the crew reluctantly agreed. Mark approached the cargo hold with Elena at his side, blaster holstered but within easy reach. He deactivated the cage's locking mechanism, and the door slid open with a hiss. Lyra stepped out cautiously, her movements as graceful as they were calculated. She stood tall, her violet eyes scanning the room, and then looked directly at Mark. "You're free to move," he said carefully, gesturing to the rest of the hold. "But no tricks." She didn't respond but tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Then, without hesitation, she moved to the far corner of the room and crouched, her back against the wall. The crew, watching from the doorway, exchanged uneasy glances. "She's not attacking," Tobias said quietly, a hint of relief in his voice. "Yet," Elena muttered. Over the next few hours, Lyra began to explore the ship. She avoided the crew whenever possible, slipping silently through corridors and observing everything with keen interest. At one point, she found herself in the engineering bay, her gaze fixed on the ship's reactor core. The hum of its energy seemed to captivate her, and she moved closer, her fingers hovering over the controls. "Careful," a voice said behind her. Lyra turned to see Mark standing in the doorway. He wasn't holding a weapon, but his posture was cautious. "That's our reactor. One wrong move, and you'll blow us all to pieces." Lyra didn't respond. Instead, she pointed to the control panel and then to herself, mimicking the flow of energy with her hands. Her meaning was clear, she understood the technology. Mark raised an eyebrow. "You know how it works?" She nodded, her expression calm but focused. "Impressive," Mark said, leaning against the doorframe. "You're not just some random prisoner, are you? You've got skills." For the first time, Lyra's expression softened slightly, and she stepped away from the reactor. She pointed at Mark, then at the translator device he carried. Mark hesitated, then handed it to her. Lyra studied the device for a moment before speaking into it in her melodic language. The device processed her words, then emitted a calm, clear translation. "You took me from him." Mark frowned. "Him? Who's him?" Lyra's expression darkened, and she gestured toward the stars visible through the ship's windows. "Hunter. Seeks me." Mark's mind raced. Whoever she was talking about wasn't just after her, they were coming for all of them. "Why? What did you do?" Lyra hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she chose her next words carefully. "Truth." Mark exhaled slowly, his mind piecing together fragments of what she was saying. "You know something. Something dangerous." Lyra nodded once, her gaze never leaving his. Back on the bridge, the ship's radar pinged with an alert. Kara, the ship's pilot, called out, "Captain, we've got an incoming vessel. Big one. Looks like a military craft." Mark's stomach sank as he entered the bridge with Lyra close behind. "How long until they're in range?" 15 minutes, Kara replied. "They're scanning the area. Probably looking for us." Mark glanced at Lyra, whose expression had shifted from calm to grim determination. She pointed at the radar and spoke into the translator. "They will not stop." Mark clenched his jaw. "Then we'll make sure they have nothing to find." Turning to the crew, he barked orders. "Kara, plot a course to the nearest asteroid cluster. Tobias, divert power to the shields. We're going to lose them in the field." As the crew scrambled into action, Mark turned to Lyra. "If you've got any more surprises, now's the time." Lyra's piercing gaze met his, and for the first time, she spoke in clear standard, her voice steady and resolute. "You saved me. Now I save you." Mark wasn't sure if her words were a promise or a warning, but as the ship accelerated toward the asteroid field, he knew one thing for certain: the real fight was only beginning. Through the asteroid gauntlet. The Nebula Runner hurtled toward the asteroid field, its engines roaring with effort as Captain Mark Hale stood on the bridge, his hands gripping the back of the pilot's chair. The military craft behind them was closing in, its sleek design and massive size a stark contrast to Mark's patched-together ship. "Distance to the field?" Mark barked, his voice tense. 2 minutes, replied Kara, the ship's pilot, her hands steady on the controls. But they'll be on top of us before we get there. Mark clenched his jaw, weighing his options. The Nebula Runner wasn't built for combat, and a direct fight would mean certain destruction. His only chance was the asteroid field ahead, a labyrinth of rock and ice that could either save them or doom them all. From the corner of his eye, Mark noticed Lyra step onto the bridge, her violet eyes scanning the holographic display of the battlefield. She moved with a calmness that unnerved the crew, her presence as commanding as it was enigmatic. "They're locking weapons," Kara called out. "Evasive maneuvers," Mark ordered. The ship lurched violently to the side as a volley of laser fire streaked past, narrowly missing the hull. Lyra approached the navigation console, her gaze focused and deliberate. Without waiting for permission, she reached for the controls. "Hey!" Kara protested, but Mark raised a hand. "Let her," he said. "She knows what she's doing." Lyra's fingers moved quickly, recalibrating the ship's course with precision. On the display, the plotted route shifted, weaving through the densest part of the asteroid field. Mark frowned. "You want us to go deeper?" Lyra nodded, speaking into the translator. "They will hesitate. We must not." The Nebula Runner plunged into the asteroid field, its hull groaning under the strain of sharp maneuvers. Massive chunks of rock loomed ahead, spinning lazily in the void. Kara's hands flew over the controls as she guided the ship through the treacherous terrain, following the path Lyra had mapped. Behind them, the military craft slowed, its weapons systems struggling to lock onto the runner amidst the interference from the asteroids. "They're holding back," said Tobias, his voice tinged with relief. "Looks like they don't want to risk it." "They won't stay back for long," Mark replied. "Kara, keep us moving." "Tobias, monitor the shields. I don't want any surprises." Lyra stood silently beside him, her sharp gaze fixed on the display. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that she was far more than a simple fugitive. She moved with the confidence of someone used to commanding attention, and her understanding of technology was beyond anything he'd seen before. "You've done this before," Mark said, half a question, half a statement. Lyra tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Many times," she replied through the translator. "But never without cost." Mark didn't have time to probe further. The ship jolted violently as a smaller asteroid grazed the shields, sending a cascade of sparks through the bridge. "Shields at 60%. Tobias called out. "We can't take too many hits like that." Mark turned to Lyra. "Can you boost the shields?" She nodded and motioned toward the engineering bay. Mark gestured for Tobias to follow her. "Go with her. Make it happen." In the engineering bay, the air was thick with tension as Lyra worked quickly, her hands moving with precision over the control panels. Tobias watched in awe as she rerouted power from non-essential systems to the shields, her understanding of the ship's mechanics almost instinctive. "How do you know all this?" Tobias asked, his voice filled with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Lyra didn't look up. "Your systems are primitive," she said simply. "They speak clearly." "Primitive?" Tobias muttered, shaking his head. "Okay, sure." As she worked, Lyra's gaze shifted to a small display showing the military craft closing in. Her expression darkened. "They are relentless." "Yeah, well, so are we," Tobias replied, trying to sound confident. Back on the bridge, the ship was nearing the far edge of the asteroid field. Mark watched as the military craft finally entered the field, its massive frame maneuvering cautiously around the larger rocks. "They're coming in," Kara said, her voice tight. "Looks like they've decided it's worth the risk." Mark nodded grimly. "Keep us moving. We're almost through." Suddenly, Lyra's voice crackled over the comms. "Captain, slow down." Mark frowned. "Slow down. They're right behind us." Trust me, Lyra replied. Mark hesitated but gestured for Kara to ease off the throttle. The ship's engines quieted slightly as their speed decreased. What's she doing? Kara muttered. Before Mark could answer, the ship jolted again, this time from a deliberate course change Lyra had initiated. On the display, the new route led them directly toward a cluster of smaller, faster-moving asteroids. Is she trying to kill us? Tobias's voice came over the comms. No, Mark said, his eyes narrowing. She's trying to set a trap. The nebula runner weaved through the cluster with precision, Lyra's adjustments guiding them through the chaos. Behind them, the military craft struggled to keep up, its massive frame ill-suited for the tight maneuvering required. They're taking heavy hits, Tobias reported. Mark watched as one of the military craft's engines was struck by an asteroid, sending it spiraling off course. The ship's remaining thrusters fired desperately, but the damage was done. They're breaking off, Kara exclaimed. They're retreating. As the nebula runner emerged from the asteroid field, the crew let out a collective sigh of relief. Mark leaned back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. Damage report? He asked. Minor, Tobias replied over the comms. We'll need to patch up the shields, but we're still flying. Mark turned to Lyra, who had just stepped back onto the bridge. That was risky. Lyra met his gaze, her expression calm. It was necessary. Mark studied her for a moment, then nodded. You saved us. Again. Lyra's eyes softened slightly, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention to the stars outside the viewport, her expression distant. Mark sighed. All right, people, let's get repairs underway and figure out our next move. This isn't over. As the crew dispersed, Mark approached Lyra. We need to talk. Lyra glanced at him, her expression unreadable. About what? About who's chasing you, Mark said firmly. And why they're willing to risk everything to catch you. For a moment, Lyra said nothing, her gaze locked on the endless expanse of space. Then, finally, she spoke. Because I hold the truth, she said quietly. And the truth is something they fear. Mark frowned, questions swirling in his mind. But as he opened his mouth to speak, the ship's comm system crackled to life with an alert. Unidentified signal detected, Kara's voice came through, tense and urgent. And it's closing fast. Mark's heart sank. The chase wasn't over. It had only just begun. The price of the truth. The nebula runner shuddered as the proximity alarms blared, cutting through the tense silence on the bridge. Mark Hale gripped the edge of the console, his eyes fixed on the holographic display as the unidentified signal grew closer. The faint hope of escape dissolved, replaced by a grim realization, their enemies were relentless. Details on the incoming vessel? Mark barked. Kara's fingers flew across her console. Smaller than the first, but faster. They're armed and closing in hard. Mark turned to Lyra, who stood at the edge of the bridge, her expression unreadable. What's so important about you that they won't let up? Lyra hesitated, her violet eyes flicking to the approaching blip on the display. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but steady. They do not fear me, Captain. They fear what I know. Mark folded his arms, his patience thinning. And what is that? She glanced around at the crew, then back at Mark. The council ruling my world has secrets, ones that could bring them to ruin. Exploitation, corruption, alliances with forces that even your kind would fear. I uncovered proof. And now they want to silence you, Mark finished, the pieces falling into place. Lyra nodded. I am not the first they have hunted. But I will be the last. The ship jolted as the pursuing craft fired a warning shot. Sparks flew from one of the consoles, and the lights flickered momentarily. Shields at 70%. Tobias's voice crackled over the comms. Mark slammed his fist against the console. Kara, get us out of here. I'm trying, she snapped, her hands moving with desperate precision. They're too fast. Lyra stepped forward, her gaze sharp. We cannot run. We must stand. Mark turned to her, his frustration evident. Stand? Against them? We're a trader ship, not a warship. You underestimate your own potential, Lyra said calmly. Your ship has systems you do not yet understand. Let me show you. Mark stared at her, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He didn't trust easily, and trusting someone like Lyra, a fugitive with secrets deeper than space itself, was a gamble. But he had no choice. Fine, he said, gesturing to the controls. You've got 2 minutes. Impress me. Lyra moved with purpose, taking over the tactical station. Her hands danced over the controls, inputting commands faster than the crew could follow. The display changed, revealing systems buried deep within the ship's code, old military-grade countermeasures disguised beneath civilian programming. What is that? Kara asked, her voice tinged with awe. Your ship's designers were smarter than you realize, Lyra replied without looking up. A failsafe, likely from a time when this vessel served a different purpose. Mark raised an eyebrow. You're saying this ship used to be military? Lyra nodded. And it still remembers. The pursuing craft fired again, this time striking the rear shields. The ship shuddered violently, and Tobias's voice came through the comms. Shields at 50%. We can't take another hit like that. Lyra's fingers flew across the controls. Then we won't. Suddenly, the ship's lights dimmed, and a low hum reverberated through the hull. On the display, a pulse began to charge in the ship's core, its energy readings spiking rapidly. What are you doing? Mark demanded. Lyra glanced at him briefly. Giving them something to fear. The pulse reached its peak, and with a sharp exhale, Lyra activated the system. A wave of energy erupted from the nebula runner, surging outward in all directions. The pursuing craft staggered as its systems overloaded, its engine sputtering and its weapons going offline. They're disabled. Kara exclaimed, her voice a mix of relief and disbelief. How did you? A directed electromagnetic pulse, Lyra explained calmly. Effective against their systems. Crude but sufficient. Mark shook his head, half impressed, half wary. You're full of surprises. The crew's celebration was short-lived as another alarm blared. Tobias's voice came through the comms, panicked. Captain, we've got a problem. That pulse drained most of our reserves. We're running on fumes. Mark cursed under his breath. Kara, how far to the nearest safe zone? Kara checked the navigation console. Not far, but with our current power levels, it'll be close. Lyra stepped away from the controls, her expression grim. There is another option. Mark turned to her, his patience wearing thin. What now? She gestured to the display, highlighting a remote sector nearby. This region contains an abandoned Zenthari outpost. It is hidden, well shielded, and may still have supplies. Mark studied the coordinates. And why would an outpost like that still be standing? Lyra hesitated. Because it is cursed. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Mark sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Cursed, huh? Fantastic. It is abandoned for a reason, Lyra said, her voice firm. But if we do not go, we will not survive the next encounter. Mark weighed the risks. Kara, set a course. We'll take our chances with the curse. The nebula runner limped toward the Zenthari outpost, its damaged systems groaning with every passing minute. The crew worked tirelessly to keep the ship running, their nerves frayed by the events of the day. Mark found himself in the observation deck, staring out at the stars. Lyra joined him silently, her presence as unsettling as it was intriguing. "You're a hard one to figure out," Mark said without looking at her. "I am not here to be understood," Lyra replied softly. "I am here to survive." Mark turned to face her. Survive? Or fight back? She held his gaze, her expression unreadable. Both. Mark exhaled deeply. "This outpost, what aren't you telling me?" Lyra looked back at the stars, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is where my people began. And where many of us ended." Mark's stomach tightened, but before he could press her further, Kara's voice crackled over the comms. "Captain, we've reached the outpost. You're going to want to see this." Mark and Lyra exchanged a glance before heading to the bridge. As they arrived, the view through the viewport stole the breath from Mark's lungs. The Zenthri outpost was a massive structure, its spires twisting into the void like jagged claws. It glowed faintly with an eerie green light, the remnants of long-abandoned systems still pulsing faintly. "What the hell is this place?" Mark muttered. Lyra stepped forward, her voice steady. "The beginning of the end." Mark stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Whatever secrets this place held, they were about to uncover them. And with those secrets, Mark suspected, would come a price far greater than any of them were prepared to pay. The ghosts of Zenthri. The Nebula Runner hovered in orbit around the Zenthri outpost, its damaged systems barely holding together as the crew stared in awe and unease at the alien structure. The station was massive, its jagged spires and shattered platforms drifting ominously against the backdrop of the stars. Faint, green pulses of energy radiated from its core, illuminating the debris field that surrounded it like a spectral halo. Mark Hale stood on the bridge, his arms crossed and his jaw tight. "Lyra, if this place is abandoned, why does it look like it's still alive?" Lyra's violet eyes remained fixed on the outpost as she replied, "It is not alive. It remembers." Mark frowned, trying to decipher her cryptic response. "Remembers what?" She turned to him, her expression unyielding. "The war. The pain. And the betrayal." The words hung heavily in the air. Mark's crew exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared speak. The outpost loomed before them, a relic of a past that seemed all too present. The decision to board the outpost wasn't an easy one, but with their fuel reserves critically low and their pursuers still hunting them, it was their only option. Mark gathered a small team, including Lyra, Elena, and Tobias, and prepared to dock with the station. As the docking clamps engaged with a hiss of pressurized air, the silence aboard the ship grew almost unbearable. Lyra stood at the airlock, her posture rigid and her face impassive. Mark noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands curled into fists at her sides. "You've been here before," he said quietly, breaking the silence. Lyra nodded but didn't elaborate. Mark didn't press her. He had learned by now that Lyra would speak when she was ready, and only then. The airlock opened with a metallic groan, revealing a corridor shrouded in darkness. The green glow from the outpost's core cast eerie shadows along the walls, which were covered in intricate carvings and alien symbols. The air was stale, tinged with the faint metallic scent of long-forgotten machinery. "This place gives me the creeps," Tobias muttered, gripping his plasma rifle tightly. "Stay sharp," Elena said, her voice steady but low. "We don't know what's waiting for us." Lyra stepped forward, her movements deliberate and confident. She ran her fingers along the carvings on the wall, her expression softening ever so slightly. "This was once a sanctuary," she said, her voice almost reverent. "A place of knowledge and peace. What happened to it?" Mark asked, his voice echoing in the stillness. Lyra paused, her gaze distant. "Greed happened. Fear. My people built this place to unite our species. Instead, it became a weapon." As they moved deeper into the outpost, the team encountered signs of its violent past. Burn marks scorched the walls, and shattered equipment lay strewn across the floors. The green glow grew brighter, emanating from a massive central chamber that pulsed with a rhythmic energy. When they entered the chamber, even Lyra seemed momentarily taken aback. The room was dominated by a towering crystalline structure, its facets shimmering with an otherworldly light. Strange machinery surrounded it, humming faintly as though it were still alive. "What is that?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lyra stepped closer to the crystal, her violet eyes reflecting its glow. "The heart of Zenthari," she said. "It is the source of the station's power, and its curse." Mark frowned. "Curse? You keep saying that. What does it mean?" Lyra turned to face him, her expression heavy with regret. This station was meant to harness energy to sustain entire worlds. But in the wrong hands, it became a weapon of destruction. Those who sought its power paid the ultimate price. Mark glanced at the crystal, then back at Lyra. "And you think we can use it to power the runner?" Lyra hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. But it will come at a cost." Elena stepped forward, her tone skeptical. "What kind of cost?" Lyra's gaze fell to the floor. "The heart will awaken. And with it, the memories of those who died here." Mark didn't have time to process Lyra's warning before the chamber's hum grew louder. The crystalline structure began to glow brighter, and a low, mournful sound filled the air. The carvings on the walls lit up, their symbols pulsing in time with the crystal's light. "What's happening?" Tobias shouted, his voice tinged with panic. Lyra stepped back, her expression grim. "It has already begun." Shadows began to coalesce around the edges of the room, forming ghostly figures that moved with deliberate, haunting grace. Their forms were translucent, their features indistinct, but their presence was undeniable. Mark raised his blaster, his instincts screaming at him to fire. "What are they?" Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she faced the figures, her voice steady. "They are echoes. Fragments of those who once lived here." "Echoes or not, they don't look friendly," Elena said, her weapon trained on the nearest figure. The shadows moved closer, their forms becoming more defined. One of them extended a hand, and a surge of energy shot toward the team. Mark dove out of the way, the blast narrowly missing him. "They're attacking!" Tobias yelled, firing his rifle. The plasma shot passed through the figure harmlessly, dissipating into the air. Lyra shouted over the chaos, "You cannot fight them with weapons. They are not alive." Mark scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. "Then how do we stop them?" Lyra turned to the heart, her voice filled with urgency. "The crystal. We must stabilize it. If we do not, these echoes will consume us." While the others fended off the relentless assault, Lyra approached the heart, her hands moving across its controls with practiced precision. The machinery responded to her touch, its hum shifting to a higher frequency. The shadows faltered, their forms flickering like dying flames. Mark joined her, his breathing heavy. "What can I do?" Lyra glanced at him, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Trust me." With a deep breath, Mark placed his hands on the console, following Lyra's lead. The controls were alien, but Lyra's guidance was clear. Together, they worked to stabilize the heart, its glow becoming steadier with each passing moment. The shadows let out a collective wail, their forms dissolving into streams of light that were drawn back into the crystal. The chamber fell silent, the oppressive energy dissipating. Mark exhaled shakily, his hands still on the console. "Is it over?" Lyra nodded, though her expression remained somber. "For now." As the team regrouped, Tobias stared at the heart with wide eyes. "That thing almost killed us, and now we're supposed to use it to power the ship." "It is our only option," Lyra said firmly. "But it will take time. The heart must be calibrated carefully, or its energy will destroy us." Mark rubbed his temples, exhaustion washing over him. Fine. Do what you need to do. But if that thing so much as twitches, I'm blowing it to hell. Lyra didn't respond, but the faint flicker of determination in her eyes told Mark that she wouldn't let that happen. As the team began their work, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the heart of Zenthari was more than just a power source. It was a warning, and perhaps, a promise of greater dangers to come. Awakening the heart. The Nebula Runner's crew worked in tense silence, the weight of their encounter with the shadows still pressing heavily on their minds. In the central chamber of the Zenthari outpost, the heart of Zenthari pulsed faintly, its crystalline facets shimmering like trapped starlight. The energy it radiated was steady now, but its presence remained ominous, a silent reminder of its destructive past. Captain Mark Hale stood near the chamber's entrance, watching as Lyra moved with practiced precision around the alien controls. She didn't hesitate, her fingers gliding over the panels as though she had designed them herself. Mark's gaze lingered on her, a mix of curiosity and suspicion in his mind. "You're more than you're letting on," he said finally, his voice low. "A fugitive, an engineer, and now an expert on ancient alien relics. Who are you, really?" Lyra paused but didn't look at him. "I told you, Captain. I am someone who knows the truth." Mark stepped closer, crossing his arms. "And this truth you're so keen to protect, does it have anything to do with why you know so much about this place?" Lyra's hands froze over the controls, her shoulders stiffening. "This outpost is a part of my people's history. Its secrets were meant to unite us. Instead, it became a monument to our downfall." Mark tilted his head, his tone sharp. "That doesn't answer my question." She turned to him then, her violet eyes hard but tinged with sorrow. "Because I was meant to lead them, Captain. This outpost was my responsibility, and I failed." The admission hung in the air like a storm cloud. Mark stared at her, stunned. "You were in charge of this place." Lyra shook her head. "Not when it fell. But I was trained to be its steward, to oversee its power and ensure it was never misused. I was a child when it was lost, but its legacy still haunts me." Mark exhaled slowly, the pieces of Lyra's story starting to form a clearer picture. "And now you think you can fix it?" Lyra's gaze softened, but her voice remained steady. "I have to try." As Lyra resumed her work, Elena and Tobias entered the chamber, their expressions wary. "Captain," Elena said, her tone tight, "we've finished patching the runner systems." "Barely. We need that power soon, or we're stuck here." Mark nodded. "Lyra's working on it." Elena cast a skeptical glance at Lyra. "And you trust her to handle, whatever this is?" "I don't have much of a choice," Mark replied. "Unless you've got a better plan." Elena sighed, clearly frustrated but unwilling to argue further. Tobias, however, stepped forward, his eyes darting nervously between Lyra and the heart. "Is it safe? That thing almost killed us back there." "It is stable now," Lyra said without looking up. "But it must be recalibrated to interface with your ship. That will take time." "How much time?" Elena pressed. Lyra hesitated, then said, "An hour, maybe less. But the process will draw attention. The heart's energy signature cannot be hidden." Mark's stomach sank. "You're saying they'll find us?" Lyra nodded. "If they are searching for me, they will see this." The warning proved prophetic. Back on the Nebula Runner, the radar began to light up with multiple signals. Kara's voice crackled through the comms. "Captain, we've got company. 3 vessels, heading straight for us." Mark cursed under his breath. "How long until they're in range?" 20 minutes, maybe less, Kara replied. "And these ships are armed to the teeth." Mark turned to Lyra. "We don't have an hour. How fast can you make this happen?" Lyra's expression hardened with resolve. "Faster, if I have help." Mark didn't hesitate. "Elena, Tobias, stay with her. Do whatever she needs. Kara, prep the ship for immediate departure. We're leaving the second that power is online. Elena saluted, though her face was grim. You better know what you're doing, Captain. I don't, Mark admitted. But I'm open to suggestions. As the enemy ships closed in, tension aboard the Nebula Runner reached a breaking point. Lyra worked feverishly, directing Elena and Tobias as they modified the ship's energy conduits to accept the heart's power. The crystalline structure glowed brighter with each adjustment, its pulses growing stronger and faster. This isn't just a power source, Tobias muttered, sweat dripping down his brow as he connected a series of cables. It's alive. Lyra glanced at him. It remembers, yes. But it does not live. That's not comforting, Tobias replied. Elena stepped back from her station, wiping grease from her hands. Connections are set. What's next? Lyra placed her hands on the heart's surface, her eyes narrowing in concentration. Now, we awaken it fully. The heart responded instantly to Lyra's touch, its glow intensifying until the entire chamber was bathed in a blinding green light. The carvings on the walls lit up again, their patterns shifting like a living script. Energy surged through the conduits, and the Nebula Runner's systems roared to life. On the bridge, Kara called out, "We've got full power, Captain. Shields, engines, everything's back online." Mark grabbed the comms. Good. Get us moving, now. The Nebula Runner disengaged from the outpost, its engines flaring with newfound strength. The enemy ships were nearly on top of them, their weapons charging for an attack. Lyra's voice came through the comms, calm but urgent. Captain, the heart's energy can be directed. I can create a barrier, but it will not last long. Mark's eyes widened. You can shield us. Briefly, she replied. But you must act quickly. Mark didn't hesitate. Do it. The heart's energy surged outward, forming a glowing barrier around the Nebula Runner. The enemy ships opened fire, but their weapons disintegrated against the barrier in bursts of green light. Shields are holding. Kara shouted, her voice filled with awe. Get us to hyperspace, Mark ordered. Now. The Nebula Runner's engines roared as it accelerated, the enemy ships scrambling to follow. The barrier flickered, its energy waning, but it held just long enough for the ship to enter hyperspace. The moment the stars stretched into infinity, the crew let out a collective breath of relief. Mark leaned heavily against the console, his heart pounding. Status, he asked. Kara grinned. We're clear. For now. In the heart's chamber, Lyra stepped back from the console, her face pale but composed. Elena and Tobias stared at her in stunned silence. You just saved us, Tobias said, his voice filled with disbelief. Lyra didn't respond. She simply turned to the heart, her gaze filled with a mix of sadness and determination. Elena frowned. What's wrong? Lyra placed a hand on the heart, her voice barely above a whisper. It is not over. They will follow. And next time, they will bring more. Mark entered the chamber, his expression grim. Then we need to be ready. Whatever you know, whatever you're running from, we need the full story. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The story is not mine alone, Captain. It is the story of a galaxy on the brink. And your kind will play a part in what comes next. Mark's stomach tightened, but he nodded. Then we'll face it. Together. Lyra tilted her head, her expression softening ever so slightly. Perhaps you are more than I thought, Captain. The room fell silent, the crew exchanging uneasy glances. They had escaped for now, but the echoes of the heart, and the dangers that followed it, were far from finished. The edge of destiny. The Nebula Runner tore through hyperspace, its engines humming with newfound vigor thanks to the ancient power coursing through its systems. The crew worked tirelessly to assess the damage from their narrow escape, but an unspoken tension loomed. The knowledge that the heart of Zenthari had drawn their enemies, and could do so again, was heavy on everyone's minds. Captain Mark Hale stood on the bridge, staring at the swirling starscape outside the viewport. His thoughts churned with unanswered questions, and the silence of the moment was deafening. Behind him, Lyra entered, her presence as steady as it was unsettling. "You are troubled, Captain." Mark turned, his expression grim. "Trouble doesn't begin to cover it. We've got an ancient weapon powering this ship, enemies hunting us, and now you're telling me humanity has a role in some galaxy-wide conflict I didn't even know existed." Lyra tilted her head slightly. "Would you prefer ignorance? To drift unaware into the storm?" Mark's jaw tightened. "I'd prefer honesty." The bridge door slid open, and Elena entered, her face drawn but focused. "Captain, we've got another problem." Mark sighed. "Of course we do. What now?" Elena handed him a datapad. "The heart's energy is overloading some of our systems. If we don't stabilize it soon, we're looking at a core breach." Mark stared at the datapad, then turned to Lyra. "Is this what you meant by cost? Because blowing up my ship wasn't part of the deal." Lyra stepped forward, her expression calm but firm. "The heart is not meant for this purpose. It was created to sustain life, not power weapons or escape machines. If we do not release its energy properly, it will consume us." "Release it?" Elena asked sharply. "And what happens when that draws every warship in the sector to our doorstep?" Lyra's gaze didn't waver. "They will come regardless. What matters is what we choose to do when they arrive." Mark's voice cut through the tension. "Options. Now." Lyra glanced at the holographic display, pulling up a map of the surrounding sectors. She pointed to a system marked Idona's Veil, a place shrouded in swirling nebulae and unexplored anomalies. "There is a temple there," she said. "One of the last remnants of my people's legacy. It is hidden, but the heart's energy can guide us to it. If we reach the temple, we can safely stabilize the heart and shield it from detection." "And if it doesn't work?" Elena asked, crossing her arms. Lyra's expression darkened. "Then we die." Mark let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Great. Just what I wanted, another impossible gamble." He turned to Kara. "Set a course for Idona's Veil. Tobias, do whatever you can to reinforce the systems. We need to hold this ship together." The Nebula Runner emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Idona's Veil, its sensors immediately overwhelmed by the chaotic energy of the nebula. Swirling clouds of blue and gold plasma danced across the void, obscuring everything beyond a few kilometers. "This place is a nightmare," Tobias muttered over the comms. "We can't see anything out there." "That's the point," Lyra replied. "The temple is hidden within the veil. Only those who carry the heart's energy can find it." Mark gripped the back of Kara's chair. "Then guide us, Lyra. Before someone else shows up." Lyra moved to the navigation console, her fingers brushing over the controls. The heart's energy pulsed faintly, resonating with the nebula's chaotic rhythms. Gradually, a path began to emerge, illuminated by faint trails of light visible only on the holographic display. "Follow this route," Lyra said. "But be warned, the veil will test us." Mark frowned. "Test us how?" Lyra didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. As the Nebula Runner ventured deeper into the veil, the ship's systems began to flicker. Lights dimmed, and the air grew heavy with an unplaceable tension. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of the crew's vision, and faint whispers echoed through the halls. "What the hell is this?" Elena demanded, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "The veil is alive," Lyra said calmly. "It feeds on fear and doubt. If you let it, it will consume you." Tobias's voice crackled over the comms, tinged with panic. "Captain, the reactor's readings are going haywire. I'm not sure how much longer we can hold this together." "Hold the course," Mark ordered, his voice steady despite the growing unease. "We're not turning back now." The ship approached a massive structure shrouded in a swirling nebula, a temple carved into the side of an asteroid, its surface adorned with glowing glyphs that pulsed in time with the heart. The sight was breathtaking, but the crew barely had time to process it before the radar lit up with hostile signals. "They found us," Kara said, her voice tight. "2 warships, closing fast." Mark's heart sank. "Can we make it to the temple before they reach us?" "Barely," Kara replied. "But we'll be sitting ducks once we're inside." Lyra stepped forward, her voice calm but commanding. "Then we must activate the temple's defenses. The heart will unlock them." Mark turned to her. "And you couldn't have mentioned this earlier?" "There was no point," she replied. "Not until we arrived." The Nebula Runner docked with the temple's outer platform, its crew disembarking quickly as the warships closed in. Lyra led the way, her movements deliberate as she guided them through the ancient halls. The air was thick with energy, the glyphs glowing brighter with each step they took. At the temple's core, a massive dais stood beneath a crystalline dome that mirrored the heart's glow. Lyra approached the dais, placing the heart at its center. The temple responded instantly, its energy surging outward in a wave that rippled through the veil. Outside, the pursuing warships hesitated, their systems faltering as the temple's defenses activated. Massive energy barriers formed around the structure, impenetrable and shimmering with raw power. On the dais, Lyra's hands moved over the controls, her expression one of intense focus. "The heart is stabilizing," she said. "But this is only the beginning." Mark stepped closer, his tone sharp. "Beginning of what?" Lyra turned to face him, her eyes glowing faintly with the heart's energy. "The awakening. My people's legacy. And humanity's place within it." Mark frowned. "What are you talking about?" Before Lyra could answer, the temple's energy surged again, and a projection filled the chamber, a map of the galaxy, marked with countless glowing points. At the center was a single, brilliant light, the heart of Zenthari. "This is what they fear," Lyra said quietly. "Not me. Not the heart. But the unity it represents. A galaxy free from their control." Mark stared at the map, the weight of her words sinking in. "And what happens now?" Lyra met his gaze, her expression resolute. "Now, Captain, we fight. Together." As the temple's defenses held off the warships, the crew of the Nebula Runner stood at the precipice of a new reality. They had escaped death, unlocked a legacy, and found themselves at the center of a conflict far greater than they had imagined. Mark turned to his crew, his voice steady. "We didn't ask for this. But we're here now. And if they want a fight, we'll give them one." The crew nodded, their fear replaced by determination. In that moment, they were no longer just a ragtag group of traitors and fugitives. They were something more. The galaxy wasn't ready for them. But it would be soon enough.